Well, thank you, Todd, and all of you at the NRD for the invitation to speak this morning. Again, like you said, my name's Andrea Basche. I'm been at the university for just a little over 3 years in the agronomy and horticulture department. I'm primarily in a teaching position, but actively involved in a lot of research, and my area has been in kind of diversified cropping systems, including cover crops. I've gotten involved in a lot of soil health related cover crop projects since I've been here, and I wanted to take the opportunity to share with you some information that is coming from a project that's supported by the NRCS, and a lot of the work has been done by the graduate student you see here on the right, Fernanda Krupek, who has been working with us for about 2 years, working on her PhD in the department. And so I recognize fully you are all in a different environment than I'm used to. I got my PhD at Iowa State University. This is a photo that I took in the spring of 2013 there, and I like to use this a lot in presentations just to get us started thinking about, when we consider our cropping systems and our environments, I like to make this point here with this photo. Well, so this is a photo that I took from the field site, or one of the field sites where I collected some data from during my PhD. This was in April of 2013, and I'm sure many of you remember what happened in 2012 across a lot of the Corn Belt. We had, major flooding events, or excuse me, major drought events, right, in 2012. And then that following spring, we had near flood conditions, at least in Ames, but shortly before I took this photo, actually. And so you can imagine that growing cover crop that you see on the left here, growing using water, taking up nitrogen as well that had been in the soil and left over from crops that did not grow as well as we would have hoped in 2012, right? And so we're in kind of an opposite pattern now, right? That we had very wet conditions, one of the wettest years on record in 2019, and now we're into drought conditions in 2020. And so 2020 into 2021. So we're in the opposite flipped weather and water pattern. And so, if we drive around the landscape, what do we see for the most part? Do our fields look like they do on the left, or do they look like they do on the right? Feel free, anybody, to chime in and to use the chat. I actually encourage you to do that. And I want to try to solicit some feedback from folks here during my presentation. And so I think most of our landscapes look like the right versus the left, and that makes me sad when I drive around Nebraska. And so I just remind us, where we're starting from, and the opportunities, and we're talking about water risks that something like having continuous cover on the landscape can offer. And so with that in mind, I want to share again work that is ongoing with a project that I've been a part of, which is supported by the NRCS. So it's a partnership. We call ourselves the Soil Health Initiative, funded by the NRCS, and they got started even before I came to the University of Nebraska. So they signed up farmers across Nebraska. You can see the map of the counties where farmers are located. 17 different farmers who signed up with EQIP contracts, and what they signed up to do was maintain replicated trials of different soil health management systems. And so they got to select what they wanted to test, and that varies from farm to farm, but a lot of what producers are doing is experimenting with different cover crop related practices. And so I'm going to show you kind of what this looks like on farm. So some of you may be familiar with how we do on-farm research, that we set up randomized replicated strips across fields to look at different treatments. And we do that across the field to try to capture the variability that exists, as you are all familiar with on a farm. And so essentially what the farmers again got to do was select kind of something that they were used to, or something they'd already been doing, and then something that was a little different. So they had to select at least 2 different treatments and have them in these replicated strips, maintaining them for 5 years. And so some of the data collection that is ongoing is cash crop yield. We collect yield monitor data or just yield data depending on what the producers have. NRCS is going out on these farms at least every 2 years to collect a soil health assessment. And they report in for the On-Farm Research Network with agronomic data. And so I want to also just give you a sense of some of the treatments that folks are working with as well. So some people are experimenting with different types of cover crops, so monocultures versus multi-species mixes. Some folks are looking at grazing cover crops and no grazing. Some are looking at different crop rotations with and without cover crops. And some are comparing kind of more traditionally what we might think of just with a no cover crop strip and cover crops. And so What I'm going to show you today, and that Todd thought would be of interest to this group, is just how we're using aerial imagery to monitor some of the changes that are ongoing on these experiments. And again, I wanted to take the time to explain that some of these fields are different than others, because that will come into play when I describe some of the things that we're seeing, and maybe, you know, getting you thinking about some ideas of how you might use imagery to monitor water needs, crop growth development, and in this case, again, how we're thinking about it with cover crops. And so what I wanted to just share next, you know, I showed you the map of the 17 different counties where there are farmer collaborators with this project. We have been working with a select group of those farms to monitor crop growing conditions throughout the growing season. And so we've been working with these select farms, and we have worked with a commercial operator to deliver imagery every about 2 weeks or so during the growing season. And again, we have this nice treatment that we can look at back to back and look for differences on these farms. And so we're collecting from this commercial operator that we worked with the last 2 years, Terravion, multispectral imagery, and we're showing you some of the bands here that are collected. And I just like to show this slide as well. Some of you may be very familiar with imagery and the science of it, but for those who are not as familiar, this is something I remind my students about when we talk about site-specific crop management, that, you know, the source of all radiation and energy on Earth comes from the sun. The sun puts out energy in a huge range of sizes and wavelengths. Of course, only within the visible spectrum are we able to see, right? And it's just that little sliver that you see in the middle of the chart here. If we zoom in more closely to, you know, the visible and just outside the visible spectrum, I'm showing you just for the point of to say that the data I'm presenting today is for the normalized difference vegetation index, NDVI, which is a pretty commonly used index to give us some indicator of greenness in the canopy or canopy density, chlorophyll content. And I'm showing you what the bands are here that go into the calculation of what is NDVI. So what NDVI can provide us is the, again, indicator of canopy density or greenness. Okay, so we're looking at NDVI on these different farms with replicated strips of treatments related mostly to cover crops. And so we broadly are referring to them as soil health management systems. And so again, we have those 17 collaborators, but I'm showing you here the subset of farms that we have imagery for in the most recent year. And so these are the ones that I want to highlight over the next several slides. And what I, again, encourage you to do, feel free to chime in if you have comments or questions, or to use the chat. I'd love to do that with Zoom. I think it's a nice way to feel like we're in the room together. Because I would love anyone's input who has experience with cover crops to help us kind of understand what we're seeing, and not to give away the punchline, but we are seeing some inconclusive trends when we monitor what's happening during the growing season on our cash crops following different cover crop treatments. And so what I'm going to do next is show you a series of slides, try to keep you engaged here mid-morning, from several different farms, mostly from 2020. And I have one from 2019 that I want to show. And I want to start with 3 different counties where they grew small grains in 2020. And I will orient you as to what you're looking at here. So this is one of our collaborators in Colfax County. And in Colfax County in 2020, the main cash crop was wheat. And I'm showing you here what the cover crop comparison was in 2019 into 2020. So they had a multi-species mix compared to strip of a multi-species mix cover crop and then a strip of no cover crop. And so this is a no-till and non-irrigated site. And so I'm showing you that information at the top. And then in the middle of the slide here, I'm showing you the average NDVI values over the course of the growing season. So we've got 4 different points here. The dark box here is the check, the lighter box is the cover crop treatment. And so what we found at this site, so these 3 points here would be during the wheat growing season, and then this would be after the wheat harvest. And so what we saw here is that there was no difference in NDVI at this site. in wheat following either a check or a cover crop. We didn't see any differences in wheat yield at this site at the end of the, or at wheat harvest. And I don't actually have a cover crop biomass estimate for you in 2019 because they were not able to get that in 2019. So our first site had wheat last year, cover, no cover, did not see any differences at all. So benefit of the cover crop in terms of improving soil health, which we are seeing some improvements in soil health across these sites, which I'm not focusing on today because I wanted to focus on the imagery, but no differences in NDVI, no differences in yield at this first site. So the next site that I want to show you had rye in 2020. And this is in Howard County, so in central Nebraska. And again, rye in 2020, a similar setup that they had a cover, no cover setup in their treatments, and they had a multi-species mix as their cover crop the year prior. And so here what we found, so we've got several different data points here, and you see several stars here, which is representing significantly different values of NDVI. So there were actually higher NDVI values following a cover crop mix at this site. So this was showing you on the graph the approximate harvest date of rye. And then after the next cover crop was planted, of course, we see a higher value in NDVI for those strips. But so higher NDVI following the cover crop. We did not see any difference in rye yield in those two treatments. And you can see that there was pretty significant biomass accumulation at this site the year prior. So if there was going to be an effect, we might see it. And actually, perhaps there was a positive effect here in NDVI throughout the growing season, but that did not translate into any difference in yield. Okay, so two sites, one was no change, one was a slightly higher change in NDVI. And then the third site that I want to show you that had small grains in 2020 was also nearby in central Nebraska in Greeley County. This site also similar no-till irrigated, had rye grown in 2020, similarly had no cover crop strip with a multi-species mix. And here we saw the opposite trend, that there was slightly higher NDVI at a few points in the growing season following the check strip. And still, again, that translated to no difference in rye yield. But you can see here that the cover crop biomass was pretty low, was much lower than the prior site the year before. So just to take a step back, we have these three sites in 2020 that we monitored during the small grain growing season and shortly after. No differences in yield at any of these sites, and three different trends in terms of what we saw with NDVI. And so, like I said, to start, that's somewhat inconclusive, and I'm going to show you a few more sites now with soybean in 2020 and in 2019 to give you a sense of maybe of what we're seeing with soybean following a cover crop. So this first site that had soybean last year is in Stanton County, so more in northeast Nebraska. And what we found here, different system where they were comparing a monoculture to a cover crop mix. And the cover crop mix had a number of different species that we hope could overwinter: cereal rye, winter barley, red clover, brassicas, hairy vetch, et cetera. And so what I'm showing you here is an image of greenness that was taken when we took the cover crop biomass samples. And so the single species, the monoculture had about 85 pounds, which is actually quite low. Multi-species, you can see a little bit of greenness here was quite low as well. So still very low biomass in both of these treatments. But even with that low biomass, we did see that, so if this was our cover crop growing season, and then or just at the beginning, of soybean planting, that later into the growing season, there were 3 time points where we saw higher NDVI following the cover crop mix, which they both were very low, but again, you can see that this was even lower. So what might have been happening here that contributed here to slightly lower cover crop biomass? And this did actually on this site, this is the one site that I'm showing you today where we did see a difference in yield, that there was 7 more bushels difference in the cover crop mix treatment. Okay, so the lower biomass treatment did lead to differences in NDVI and slightly different yield. Okay, so I have 2 more that I want to show you as well here. So the next site that had soybean last year is in Nemaha County, so in southeast Nebraska. And so they had also a similar setup in terms of the cover crops that they were comparing, winter terminated and winter hardy. And so you can see here the amount of biomass in the winter hardy treatment, about 800 pounds. So more than the last site, but still on the smaller side. And then, you know, the winter estimate in the spring, we were not able to get an estimate last spring of any of that biomass. And so what you see in the NDVI graphs is that there was also higher NDVI values into the growing season following the winter terminated cover crop here as well. So a similar pattern in these 2 sites between Northeast and Southeast Nebraska in 2020 with soybean following the cover crop treatment that had less biomass. And I'm going to pull this all together for you if you're not quite keeping score, but this site, they did not see any yield differences. And finally, I have 1 site left I want to share. This is Howard County again, but this is their 2019 data. And so we actually have published this and talked about this in several different venues. My graduate student, Fernanda, and I were featured in a Market Journal story back in December talking about this site and these results right here that I'm showing you. And we've written 2 Crop Watch articles about this. But in Howard County in 2019, they were growing soybean. I showed you their rye in 2020 previously. But what we found here also, and this was a cover, no cover comparison, is that the no cover crop treatment had higher NDVI values earlier in the middle of the growing season, but that the cover crop had higher NDVI. The soybean following the cover crop had higher NDVI later in the season. So this is following that same pattern that we saw on those other 2 sites. No difference in the soybean yield here. And again, this site did have really good cover crop growth, almost 3,000 pounds per acre. And I also want to show you what the NDVI values look like and what just a normal photo looked like from this site. And so here are the NDVI values from July, when you can see the cover crop strip has lower values, the checks have higher values. And the reverse trend here happening in September, but you can see that there is developmentally a huge difference, that there is earlier senescence in the cover crop check, which of course would contribute to the lower NDVI value, compared to less leaf drop, more green, and less, just a slower development here of the soybean following the cover crop, which we think is really interesting because we are trying to look across all these sites as I'm showing you to make sense of the data we're finding, and how can we use this information to hopefully improve decision making in the future. And so I'm pulling this all together here as I would hope to wrap up a little bit and maybe get some of your input. But this is kind of the summary of all of these sites. I showed you first the 3 with small grains and then the 3 with soybean. And again, I think this pattern is quite interesting, that the soybean following lower cover crop biomass seem to have higher NDVI, but that often does not translate into any yield difference. Of course, all of these are showing none except for one of the sites. But the soil trend too, as I've already alluded to, is really positive, that we see where there's cover and no cover, we see higher soil health scores. Following a cover crop, we see increasing trends with the continued use of some of these soil health management systems with time, including an infiltration, which we obviously know is really important when we think back to that first picture and the benefits that growing cover can provide for us. So, pulling this together, I wanted to say this at the beginning, but I'm going to make this point hopefully quite clear to us, is that we're really excited about this type of work because yield is just one thing. That's what I tell my students too. Yield only tells us, yield is the combination of all the things that happen, all the decisions that we make, right? And having imagery as a diagnostic tool can tell us something more specific about the impact of the cover crop. And here it could be that something may be happening with the cover crop, delaying potentially development in some way of soybean, but leading to minimal yield differences, which is the next point that I want to make, that we've seen either no in some crops and fields with the small grains, we saw kind of inconclusive results, but that it does look like something could be happening here with soybeans. And we're really not sure why this might be occurring. And that's something that I'd love to, hear thoughts or have some discussion about what might be occurring. And even with some of these minor differences that we see, we do see soil properties, soil health scores increasing over time with the use of soil health management systems. And so again, I see some chat. I'm going to pull that up in just a second. I'd love any thoughts you might have about why this might be occurring. I've added a few ideas here. Todd is asking me if the cover crops were the same at all locations. So not all exactly the same. Cereal rye was probably involved in all of them. I tried to show on each of the slides what the cover crops were. In a lot of cases, they were multi-species mixes, but rye was often a part of it. So, what's the impact the cover crop might be having on moisture and temperature? Is this contributing to some differences in stand counts? Accelerating or delaying germination? Is this something to do with weeds? We're not totally sure, but again, I think that first point is important to consider, that this can tell us more about what's happening during the growing season than just that final point in yield. So I have a few other slides just to share kind of a little bit really briefly where you can learn more about our project and about our team, but I wanted to just pause if there's any questions, comments, or thoughts here. And for all of you, if you're using imagery for different environments or management systems, feel free to share any thoughts that you have, what you find works or doesn't work or is beneficial.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Are there questions about Andrea's presentation, cover crops, aerial imagery? Not seeing any questions here in Holders. Do we have anything online? Okay, well, apparently you covered it very well, Andrea. I think we can move on to your last slide. So.
Sure. Yeah, and just to share, this is really a great collaborative effort. We work with extension educators across the state. We have the on-farm research network that we're connected into, and then the agronomy and horticulture department and the research that we're doing. And of course, we're supported by the NRCS. Aaron Hurd is the state soil health coordinator right here in the center of our project. This was last year at our on-farm research collaborator meeting at the end of February, before lots of things changed. And I would point you to, we have some crop watch articles that detail some of the ways that we're trying to use imagery. In particular, we feature the farm in Howard County in 2019 and what we saw there. You can find the on-farm research reports at cropwatch.unl.edu/soil health, and some of our market journal features from field days and about the imagery that I have been speaking about here. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. I see there's a comment in the chat, but yeah, feel free to reach out to me or learn more about our project. Like I said, I think that the imagery can be a nice diagnostic tool to tell us more about what's happening in season. And the idea would be that this can give us more information about site variability, potentially to lead to, if it's subfield management strategies with cover crops, if this means, you see a difference and it would help you make, apply more irrigation water, even if it's slight, following a cover crop, or less. I don't know. I think that it has a lot of potential application, but we're just, I think in the beginning stages of how we use this information.
Okay, Andrea, your research is ongoing on this?
It's ongoing.
And are you tied in with the Soil Health Task Force with the state of Nebraska?
Yeah, so we have Yes, we have been in touch with them. Aaron Hurd has been, in close collaboration with the task force. In fact, he may be one of the members of it, but one of the collaborators is on the task force. So we're aware of their initiatives, and I, am supportive of their efforts to bring different folks together and, create learning hubs. And I think that this network that we've created of the producers could be, a nice demonstration of the collaborations that could exist. So we've, yes, been in touch and are aware of the report. I think I really enjoyed reading. I think it has a lot of opportunity for the state and for my students too, for my undergraduate students to connect into and learn.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time and for your very interesting presentation.
Yeah, thank you too.